The Washington Times reported last week on a story out of the United Kingdom. A man by the name of Adam Smith Connor, a 20-year Army veteran, was arrested for antisocial behavior. Taken to court, he was convicted and fined nearly $12,000 and given 2 years of probation. What was his crime? Well, Adam Smith Connor was standing on a street where there was an abortion clinic. With his back turned from the abortion clinic, he closed his eyes, bowed his head, and clasped his hands while he prayed silently. When confronted, he was arrested, taken to court, and convicted. Now, if he had been standing in the same posture, in the same location, but thinking about a math problem that he was trying to figure out, or how to get to his next location on Google Maps, he'd have been fine. His crime was he was talking to God. They decided that that was harmful to the abortion clinic, convicted him of antisocial behavior, and this case becomes a precedent for the first ever thought crime conviction in the United Kingdom. He's guilty of thinking thoughts of which the government does not approve. Well, that could never happen here, right? Let's talk. In recent days, 2 former secretaries of state have recently called for government action against what they term misinformation, the First Amendment notwithstanding. Speaking at the World Economic Forum's Sustainable Development Impact meeting in New York, John Kerry, former Secretary of State, told the audience, and this is a quote, "If people only go to one source for news, and the source they go to is sick or has an agenda, and they're putting out disinformation, our First Amendment stands as a major block to be able to just, hammer it out of existence. So what we need is to win the ground, win the right to govern by hopefully winning enough votes that you're free to be able to implement change." Imagine that. A man who for years, in service through the Senate and then in the cabinet of a president, has said that the problem is the First Amendment is a roadblock to stamping out speech that the government doesn't like. Well, my answer is, Mr. Kerry, that's precisely what it is. It was designed for that purpose. It was designed to protect the free expression of speech from you people who want to decide not only what we can say, but eventually what we're even allowed to think. Well, he's not the only one. Another former Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton, not too long ago on MSNBC's The Rachel Maddow Show, was talking about the problem with Russian interference in American elections. Now, she underlined correctly the importance of seeking criminal sanctions for foreign agents who unlawfully try to influence U.S. elections and U.S. policy. She's right about that. But she couldn't contain herself, and she went on to say, "I also think there are Americans who are engaged in this kind of propaganda, and whether they should be civilly or even in some cases criminally charged is something that would be a better deterrence." Well, she's right. You start throwing people in jail, that becomes a pretty good deterrence. But what she's suggesting is that the government now use the law, criminal law specifically, to punish political opponents by defining any opposition as misinformation. Well, Minnesota Governor Tim Walz, who would not even be on the radar were he not a candidate for vice president in this year's elections, he recently said on a different MSNBC show, he said there's no guarantee to free speech on misinformation or hate speech, and especially around our democracy. Well, that statement, ironically, is misinformation, because the Supreme Court has said that there is no hate speech exception to the First Amendment. The Supreme Court has allowed the possibility of hate speech as an inherent element of what it means to protect speech. There's no reason to protect speech that everybody's okay with. Speech is only protected, it only needs to be protected when it is controversial or displeasing to some elements within society. The Supreme Court disagrees with Tim Walz, which is maybe why he so wants to radically change the Supreme Court. That same Supreme Court, by the way, also struck down what's called the Stolen Valor Act, which criminalized lying about one's military service record. The fact that the Supreme Court did that recently is probably good for Governor Walz. Well, what is all this representative of? Well, what you need to understand as a follower of Jesus Christ is that secular progressivism is, in fact, a religion. It is a belief system based on certain core values, or what we call doctrines. And the high priests of that religion are those who seek and demand absolute political power. We see it in our government overlords, who typically already have the practice of denying Christian organizations with public funding that is available for more secularized organizations. For example, in the state of Maine, a private Christian school lost access to choice vouchers after the state changed its requirements to exclude schools with a religious perspective. In other words, they have a program that pays parents out of the tax base that is paid into the government. They pay parents back in order to use money to provide the education of their choice for their children, just so long as none of those choices have an actual non-secular worldview. In the state of Minnesota, public schools have refused requests from Muslim parents to offer an opt-out for lessons on LGBTQ themes. In other words, in the state of Minnesota, even Muslims are discriminated against religiously because they're not even given the option of taking their children out of LGBTQ materials that are taught in the public schools. What is such a threat to parents having control over the content of material that goes into their child's mind? The threat is progressivism, this religion of absolute power, is so intellectually vapid, so hollow inside, that it cannot sustain itself in an open marketplace of ideas. Christianity has been attacked, it has been critiqued, it has been argued against for 2,000 years, and yet it has a substance to it that has allowed it to withstand those attacks and to prevail in every conversation, in every culture for the last 20 centuries. And yet progressivism is so unstable inherently that the only way they can sustain this secularized worldview is to absolutely eliminate any opposing opinions that would show the weakness or the hollowness of secular ideas. In Michigan, one of the country's most significant Christian adoption and foster care organizations lost their funding from the state for a long-time refugee resettlement program. It was the #1 private agency assisting with the resettlement and the establishment of refugees that have been brought to Michigan to help establish them with housing and employment and the things that they need in order to make new lives. This organization was kicked off of the list of those organizations that receive funding from the state simply because they have a religious standard by which they hire their employees. Now, that organization has turned around and sued the state for religious discrimination, which I applaud, because this organization, Bethany Christian Services, they require their employees to sign a statement of faith, And frankly, I've read it. It is nothing more than a modern version of the Apostles' Creed. It is the most basic, straightforward affirmation of Christian doctrine probably ever composed. But that's too much for the Michigan state government. They have decided that despite the First Amendment protecting religious hiring practices, they have concluded that the requirement for a statement of faith violates the law. And so they have kicked this organization off the rolls of those eligible for state funds to accomplish a practice that is in the state's best interest. In other words, they're cutting off their nose to spite their own face. Oh, by the way, Bethany Christian Services, they first began working alongside the Michigan state government in 1981. But now, 40 years later, all of a sudden, they're too dangerous to be allowed in the public square. And Michigan has decided that they will not be allowed to do business in that state. Listen, there's a reason Christian organizations have founded hospitals, orphanages, social service agencies like the YMCA, like the Salvation Army, like the Children's Aid Society. We don't do that because we're in the benevolence business. We do that because God has grafted into the hearts of His people the DNA, the heartbeat of Jesus Himself. And we display that heartbeat through these tangible and practical expressions of our calling as Jesus followers. We've always done it, and we always will. One of the things that set Christians apart in ancient Rome was they went outside the city walls each night and rescued babies that had been placed there and left to be exposed to the weather and to the wild animals. Christians have always been about helping the neediest and the poorest and the weakest among us. That won't stop just because the state refuses to participate in funding, but it does make you ask a question. Why are they willing to promote an ideology at the expense of ministry that actually helps the citizens for which state government has responsibility? Well, how do we stay on the good side? I mean, how do we avoid being in this position of having to potentially disobey the government? How do we stay out of this scenario where we become convicted for the things that we think in our heads? Well, the Pope gives us a recent example. The Pope, the supposed leader of the Roman Catholic Church worldwide, recently on a 3-day trip to Singapore spoke to a group of young people at a Catholic junior college. There, he improvised on a prepared script and went on to talk about how they should never impose their ideas of God on anybody else because, and this is a tired old conversation, but it's only significant because this is the Pope. He said, every religion is a way to arrive at God. He made the analogy that different religions are akin to different languages. He mocked the idea that my God is more important or truer than your God because, as he said, there's only one God, but he expresses himself in different languages in different cultures. He said some are Sikh, some Muslim, Hindu, Christian, and they are all paths to God. Well, this is a theological idea that Karl Rahner, back in the 1970s, a Catholic theologian, argued for. It was called the anonymous Christian. This Pope has said in a variety of places that you can be a Christian, acceptable to God, and granted access to heaven, even if you not only don't know Jesus, but if you reject him at some point in your life. In other words, he undermines all of the words that Jesus said about himself. I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except by me. The Pope is interested in making sure the church never runs afoul of progressive culture. Let me tell you what that is. That is an abdication of spiritual leadership This Pope is not a spiritual father. He is not a biblical theologian. He is wrapping his arms in a bear hug around heresy and falsehood. But he won't get in trouble with the government because he fits perfectly with the progressive ideology. How do we approach this biblically? Well, when it comes to the question, are you praying? Are you thinking God thoughts? You can't do that. You have to think about something else. You can't have those thoughts in your head. You can't have standards based on the Bible. Here's what we say. We stand with the apostles, Peter and John, who, arrested in Acts chapter 4, find themselves before the Sanhedrin, the religious body of religious scholars in that day, and they were instructed by this body, you've got to stop talking about Jesus. To which they answered this. In Acts chapter 4, verses 19 and 20, but Peter and John replied, judge for yourselves whether it is right in God's sight to obey you rather than God. For we cannot help speaking about what we have seen and heard. That must be the Christian response to secular progressivism as they increasingly demand that we no longer live by our beliefs, we no longer articulate our beliefs, we no longer think thoughts about our beliefs. Well, you decide for yourself what you can do. But as for us, we can't do anything but present Jesus Christ. Well, what do you say to people like the Pope, who has sold out his authority, abdicated his responsibility as a so-called spiritual leader? Well, I find a verse in the little postcard called Jude. Jude is talking about spiritual leaders in his book, and he says this in verse 16, these men, these so-called spiritual leaders, they're grumblers and fault finders. They follow their own evil desires. They boast about themselves and flatter others to their own advantage. Our answer to the secular progressives is, do what you need to do, but as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. And our answer to heretics within the Christian community, you flatter yourself for your own advantage, and you confuse others to gain a foothold. Like Martin Luther, our response is to take the Bible firmly in hand and say, here I stand. I can do no other. Let us be faithful to the Word of God. Let us be bold in a culture increasingly hostile, not to just our words, but now even to our thoughts. And let the John Kerrys and Hillary Clintons and false popes of the world take note. We don't answer to them. Stand for Jesus Christ. Speak truth. Think biblical thoughts. Live by what's true. This is Truth Currents.